Frank Miller had been teaching mixed martial arts for over 20 years in the small town of Riverdale. At 58, his body still moved with the precision and control of someone half his age. The local gym he owned, Miller's Combat Zone, had become a safe place for those seeking discipline and strength. On a hot Tuesday afternoon, Frank was showing an arm bar move to his advanced class when the door to the gym swung open. A group of teenage boys walked in with attitude. They were led by a tall, skinny boy who had a smirk on his face that showed he was looking for trouble. "Can I help you, boys?" Frank asked, keeping his professional manner despite being interrupted. "Yeah," the leader of the group, a 17-year-old, named Kyle Peterson, replied. "We heard this is where all the wannabe tough guys come to play fight." The class of 12 students, ranging from 20 to 45 years old, turned toward the noise. Frank signaled for them to continue practicing, while he dealt with the situation. "This is a place of learning and respect," Frank said calmly. "If you're interested in classes, I'd be happy to talk about options. Otherwise, I'll have to ask you to leave." Kyle's smirk grew wider. "My cousin told me about you. Said your grandpa. Claims he trained special forces back in the day. Said he was some kind of legend." The teenager laughed. "No offense, old man, but that's some serious bull. Nobody from this nowhere town ever did anything that mattered." The gym fell silent. Frank's students knew about his grandfather, Jack Miller, a decorated veteran who had indeed trained elite soldiers during his military career. The teenagers had unknowingly stepped into dangerous territory. Frank's weathered face stayed calm, but a small twitch under his left eye showed his rising anger. "Last chance to walk out with your dignity intact, son." "Or what?" Kyle challenged, stepping closer. "Your imaginary special forces grandpa gonna come save you?" The slap happened so quickly that none of the teenagers saw it coming. Frank's open palm hit Kyle's cheek with just enough force to sting without causing injury. A warning, not a punishment. "That's assault," Kyle yelled, holding his reddened face. "I'm calling the cops." Just then, the gym door opened again. Standing in the entrance with the afternoon sun behind him was a figure everyone in the room recognized right away: Sylvester Stallone. No one made a sound. Even Kyle and his friends were suddenly quiet, too shocked to speak. "Bad time?" Stallone asked, his unique voice breaking the silence. Frank stood frozen, his hand still tingling from the slap he'd given. "Mr. Stallone, we were just having a small disagreement." Kyle opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. Yeah, kid, and you're making a scene in my friend's gym," Stallone said, walking into the room with the confidence of someone used to getting attention. "Your friend?" Kyle asked, his earlier confidence now gone. Stallone nodded and turned to Frank. "Jack's grandson, right? Been meaning to visit since I heard you open this place." Frank reached out his hand, which Stallone shook firmly. "My grandfather. Would be honored you remembered him, sir." Stallone laughed. "Honored. Jack Miller was the toughest instructor I ever had. The man put me through hell during research for that military film back in '86. Kyle's face changed from shock to confusion. "Wait, what's happening?" Stallone turned his attention to the teenager. "Let me guess. You thought the old, 'my grandpa trained special forces' story was made up?" He shook his head. "Kid, Jack Miller didn't just train special forces. He wrote the book on close-quarters combat that's still used today." From his jacket pocket, Stallone pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook. "Been meaning to return this to the Miller family for years. Your grandfather lent it to me for character research, full of techniques that were classified at the time." Frank took the notebook with shaking hands. He had heard about this notebook in family stories but had thought it was lost forever. "But that's not why I'm here," Stallone continued. "I'm looking at locations for a new project. Science fiction story about Earth's special forces facing an alien threat. Thought I might find some real combat moves here." Kyle's friends had backed toward the door, clearly wanting to leave, but Kyle himself seemed stuck in place, his earlier bad behavior hanging in the air between him and Frank. "I think," Stallone said, looking straight at Kyle, "that you owe Mr. Miller an apology. And then maybe, if he's willing, you might learn something worth knowing." Outside the gym windows, a sleek black SUV with government plates pulled into the parking lot. Two men in plain suits got out and stood waiting by the vehicle. "They're with me," Stallone explained, noticing Frank's worried glance. "Part of the research team. But there's something else you should know, Frank. Something your grandfather was part of that's been classified until recently." He looked around at the gathered students and teenagers. "Something that's becoming relevant again." Frank felt a chill run down his spine. The serious look in Stallone's eyes told him this wasn't just about a movie. Whatever was in that notebook, his grandfather had written whatever his grandfather had been involved in. It was real. And somehow it had brought Sylvester Stallone to his small-town gym on this ordinary Tuesday that had suddenly become anything but ordinary. Kyle stood frozen, his cheek still red from Frank's slap, looking from Frank to Stallone and back again. The teenager's world had just been turned upside down. The man he had mocked minutes ago was apparently connected to something big enough to involve both Hollywood royalty and government agents. Frank took a deep breath. He had always known his grandfather was special, but he was about to find out just how special and what it would mean for his own future. The two men in suits watched from the parking lot as Frank led Stallone and Kyle to his office at the back of the gym. Frank's regular students whispered among themselves, trying to figure out why a famous movie star had just walked into their small-town gym. "Please sit down," Frank said, gesturing to the chairs in his modest office. The walls were covered with old photos, many showing a younger Frank alongside an older man who had to be his grandfather, Jack Miller. Kyle remained, standing, his face still red from the slap and his eyes wide as he stared at Stallone. "Is he really your friend?" Kyle asked Frank, pointing at Stallone. "No, we've never met," Frank admitted. "But my grandfather and Mr. Stallone knew each other." Stallone nodded. Jack Miller was a legend in military circles, not the kind they make movies about because most of what he did was too secret to share. But those of us who needed to know, knew. Frank picked up the leather notebook Stallone had given him and carefully opened it. Inside were detailed drawings of fighting moves, handwritten notes, and diagrams that looked like nothing Frank had ever seen in his martial arts training. "These moves," Frank said, flipping through the pages, "they don't look like standard combat techniques." "They're not," Stallone replied. "Your grandfather developed them for a very specific purpose. That's what I've come to talk to you about, along with those agents outside." Kyle shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe I should go." "No," Stallone said firmly. "You might as well hear this too. You're already involved just by being here." Frank closed the notebook and looked at Stallone. "What is this really about? Why come to me now?" Stallone leaned forward. "The movie I mentioned is real. I am scouting locations. But it's also a cover story for something bigger. Those men outside are from a division of the government that most people don't know exists." "Like Men in Black?" Kyle asked, a hint of his earlier attitude returning. "Not quite," Stallone said with a small smile. "But not entirely different either. They monitor threats that are, let's say, not from around here." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Are you talking about terrorists?" "I'm talking about visitors," Stallone said carefully. "From much further away than any country on Earth." The room went silent as his meaning became clear. "You're saying aliens?" Kyle blurted out. "Like actual aliens from space?" "In 1972, Stallone continued, ignoring Kyle's outburst, "your grandfather was recruited for a special project after an incident in New Mexico. Something crashed in the desert. It wasn't a weather balloon or a Soviet satellite." Frank shook his head in disbelief. "My grandfather never mentioned anything like this to me." "He couldn't," Stallone replied. "He signed agreements that prevented him from discussing it with anyone who wasn't cleared. But he did prepare for a day when the knowledge might need to be passed on." He tapped the notebook. "This is part of that preparation." Frank flipped through the notebook again, looking more carefully at the strange techniques. "These moves, they're designed to fight something that's not human." "Exactly," Stallone said. "Your grandfather realized that human combat techniques wouldn't work against beings with different physical capabilities. He created an entirely new system based on what he learned." "Learned how?" Frank asked. Stallone's face grew serious. From direct experience, the visitors weren't all friendly. Your grandfather was one of the few humans who ever engaged with one in hand-to-hand combat and survived. Kyle had been listening with growing interest. So why now? Why come here today? With government agents? Because, Stallone said, 3 days ago, deep space monitoring stations picked up objects entering our solar system, objects that match the signature of the vessel your grandfather encountered in 1972. A knock on the office door interrupted them. One of the agents from the parking lot stuck his head in. "Mr. Stallone, we need to speak with you." "There's been a development." Stallone stood up. "I'll be right back. Frank, maybe show the kid some of those basic moves your grandfather developed. He might need them sooner than you think." After Stallone left with the agent, Kyle turned to Frank. "I'm sorry. About what I said earlier. About your grandfather." Frank nodded, accepting the apology. "You couldn't have known." "Do you really believe all this?" Kyle asked. "About aliens and your grandfather fighting them?" Frank looked down at the notebook in his hands. "My grandfather was the most honest man I ever knew. If he created these techniques, he had a reason." He stood up and moved to the center of the small office. "Want to see one of them?" Kyle nodded eagerly, his earlier hostility completely gone. Frank demonstrated a stance that looked nothing like traditional martial arts. "This is called the anchor. According to these notes, it's designed to counter opponents who can move faster than human reflexes can track." Kyle tried to copy the stance, but his balance was off. Frank corrected his foot position. "The key," Frank explained, "is to predict where your opponent will be, not where they are now. Humans telegraph their moves. According to my grandfather, these visitors don't." Outside the office, they could hear Stallone's voice rising as he argued with the agents. Something had clearly happened. Frank continued showing Kyle the basic movements, surprised at how quickly the teenager was picking them up. For all his attitude, Kyle had natural ability. "You know," Frank said, "you could be good at this with proper training." Kyle smiled. "Really?" The door burst open and Stallone rushed back in, his face grim. "We have a problem. Those objects I mentioned, they're not just coming, they're here and they've made contact already." "Where?" Frank asked. "At the observatory outside town," Stallone replied. "The same one where Kyle's father works." Kyle's face went pale. "My dad? What does he have to do with this?" "Possibly nothing," Stallone said. "But he was on duty last night when something unusual was detected, and now no one at the observatory is answering calls." Kyle pulled out his phone. "I need to call him." "Wait," Frank said, placing a hand on Kyle's arm. "If these visitors are hostile, calling might put him in danger." "Or he might already be in danger," Kyle argued. "I have to know if he's okay." Stallone and Frank exchanged glances. "Let him try," Stallone decided. "But on speaker, we need to hear his father's voice." Kyle dialed his father's number with shaking hands. The phone rang several times before someone picked up. "Hello?" The voice sounded like Kyle's father, but somehow flat, without emotion. "Dad," Kyle said. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm at work," his father replied in that same emotionless tone. "Everything is fine. I'll be home later." "Dad, there are people here asking about you." "About the observatory." There was a pause too long to be natural. "Who is asking?" Frank quickly shook his head at Kyle, warning him not to mention Stallone or the agents. "Just some people," Kyle said, vaguely. "When are you coming home? Mom's worried." "Tell them I'm fine," his father said. "I have to go now." The line went dead. Kyle looked up at Frank and Stallone, his face filled with fear. "That didn't sound like my dad." "Not really." "No," Stallone agreed. "It didn't." Frank, Stallone, and Kyle left the office and went back to the main gym area. The two government agents were waiting for them. Frank noticed that his students had all left, probably told to go home by the agents. "This is Agent Ross and Agent Clark," Stallone said, introducing the two men in suits. "They're experts on these visitors." "My dad is in trouble, isn't he?" Kyle asked, his voice shaking. Agent Ross nodded. Based on that phone call, we believe your father may be under their influence. What does that mean? Kyle demanded. Like, mind control? Not exactly, Agent Clark explained. These beings don't have physical forms that can survive in our atmosphere for long. They need human hosts, but they don't completely take over. They integrate. Frank frowned. So Kyle's father is still in there, still aware? Yes, Ross confirmed. The host remains conscious but can't control their own actions. It's like being a passenger in your own body. Kyle's face paled. We have to help him. That's why we're here, Stallone said. Your grandfather, he continued, turning to Frank, developed techniques not just for fighting these beings, but for forcing them out of human hosts without harming the person. Frank looked down at the notebook in his hands. That's what these strange moves are for. Not just combat, but liberation. Exactly, Clark said. Jack Miller discovered that certain pressure points and movement patterns could disrupt the connection between the visitor and the human host. It's not about hurting the host, but about making it impossible for the visitor to maintain control. So what's the plan? Kyle asked. How do we help my dad? Ross checked his watch. First, we need to confirm the situation at the observatory. We have a team heading there now, but they won't arrive for another hour. We can't wait that long, Kyle insisted. My dad could be in serious danger. Frank put a hand on Kyle's shoulder. We won't wait. But we need to be smart about this. If these visitors are as dangerous as they say, we need to be prepared. Stallone nodded in agreement. Frank's right. The notebook is only part of what we need. Jack Miller also created special equipment for dealing with these situations. Where is this equipment? Frank asked. In a secure storage facility, Ross replied. About 20 minutes from here. Then let's go, Frank said decisively. Kyle, call your mother. Tell her to stay at a friend's house tonight. Don't mention any of this, just say there's a problem with the heating in your house or something. As Kyle stepped away to make the call, Stallone pulled Frank aside. There's something you should know, Stallone said quietly. The techniques in that notebook. They're not just about fighting or liberating hosts, they're about something more. What do you mean? Frank asked. Your grandfather believed these visitors had been coming to Earth for thousands of years. He thought they might have influenced human evolution, maybe even helped us develop certain abilities. Frank stared at Stallone in disbelief. Are you saying my grandfather thought humans were part alien? Not exactly, Stallone replied. He believed that certain human traits, like our capacity to keep fighting even when outmatched, might have developed as a response to early encounters with these beings. It's why he called his combat system the human response. Before Frank could ask more questions, Kyle returned, looking worried. My mom's not answering, he said. That's not like her. Ross and Clark exchanged concerned glances. We need to move now, Clark said. If they've already gotten to Kyle's mother. Gotten to her? Kyle's voice rose in panic. What are they doing to my parents? Stay calm, Frank said firmly. Panic won't help them. The group quickly moved to the parking lot. Ross and Clark led them to the black government SUV. As they approached the vehicle, Frank noticed something odd about the evening sky. The stars seemed brighter than usual, and one in particular was moving in a way stars definitely shouldn't. Look, he said, pointing up. Everyone followed his gaze. The moving light grew brighter as they watched. That's not a satellite, Stallone said grimly. Ross pulled out a small device that looked like a smartphone but with strange attachments. He aimed it at the light. It's one of them, a scout ship. How many of these things are there? Frank asked. We don't know, Clark admitted. The 1972 encounter involved just one craft. This time, our deep space monitoring has detected at least 5 objects on approach to Earth. Kyle was still staring at the moving light. What do they want? Why are they here? Your grandfather had a theory about that too, Stallone told Frank. He believed they're collectors of sorts. They seek out species with unique traits and harvest them. Harvest? Frank repeated. Genetic material, knowledge, abilities, Ross explained. They're like scientists studying specimens, but their methods aren't gentle. The light in the sky suddenly accelerated and disappeared over the horizon, heading in the direction of the observatory where Kyle's father worked. "We need to hurry," Clark said, opening the SUV doors. As they piled into the vehicle, Frank grabbed Kyle's arm. "Remember those moves I showed you? The ones from my grandfather's notebook?" Kyle nodded. "Practice them in your head while we drive. Visualize every step, every position. If my grandfather was right, these techniques might be our only advantage." Ross drove fast through the darkening streets of Riverdale. The town seemed oddly quiet, with fewer people out than usual for this time of evening. "Something's not right," Frank muttered, looking out the window. "Where is everyone?" "They might be extending their influence," Clark suggested, starting with the observatory staff, then moving to their families, then outward. "Like an infection," Stallone added. Kyle was silent, his eyes closed as he mentally practiced the strange movements Frank had shown him. His hands made small gestures in his lap, tracing patterns in the air. "We're almost there," Ross announced as they turned onto a narrow road leading up into the hills where the secure storage facility was located. Suddenly, the engine of the SUV sputtered and died. All the dashboard lights went out at once. "What happened?" Stallone demanded. Ross tried to restart the engine, but nothing happened. "It's dead, completely dead." Clark pulled out a handheld device and scanned the area. "We're being jammed, some kind of energy field." Frank looked out the window again and saw several cars stopped along the road ahead of them. The drivers were standing outside their vehicles, looking confused. "It's not just us," he said. "They're cutting off access to the storage facility," Ross realized. "They know what we're after." "How would they know that?" Frank asked. "They must have accessed the knowledge from someone who already knew," Clark said grimly. "Someone like my dad," Kyle finished, opening his eyes. "If they can control him, they can read his mind, can't they?" "Not exactly read," Ross corrected, "but they can access memories, knowledge." "So they know everything my dad knows," Kyle said. "And he knew about the storage facility?" "He helped maintain some of the equipment," Clark admitted. "Your father is a skilled engineer." "Then they know we're coming," Frank concluded. "And they're ready for us." Stallone looked at Frank. "Your grandfather always said that when conventional methods fail, human ingenuity becomes our greatest weapon." Frank nodded, making a decision. "We continue on foot. We stick to the woods alongside the road. They might be watching the road, but maybe not the forest. It's 3 miles to the facility," Ross warned. "Then we better start walking," Frank replied, opening the SUV door, "and hope we're not too late." The small group moved silently through the dark woods. Frank led the way, using skills he had learned from his grandfather years ago. Behind him came Kyle, then Stallone, with agents Ross and Clark taking up the rear. The night was unusually quiet. No sounds of animals or insects filled the air. It was as if nature itself knew something was wrong. "How much further?" Kyle whispered after they had been walking for about half an hour. "Another mile," Ross replied softly. "We're making good time." Frank suddenly held up his hand, signaling everyone to stop. He pointed ahead. Through the trees, they could see lights, moving on the road that ran parallel to their path through the woods. "Flashlights," Frank whispered. "Someone's searching the area." They crouched down behind some thick bushes and watched. Several people were walking along the road, moving slowly and methodically. They carried flashlights but used them in an odd way, sweeping them in perfect unison across the ground. "Those aren't regular people," Stallone said quietly. "Look at how they move. Too perfect, too coordinated." "More hosts," Clark confirmed. "Like Kyle's father." Kyle stared at the distant figures, wondering if his dad was among them. "How many people have they taken over?" "Hard to say," Ross replied. "But if they're searching like this, they must know we abandoned the car." Frank studied the search pattern. "They're assuming we stayed on the road. They don't expect us to go through the woods." "Why not?" Kyle asked. "Because that's not the logical choice," Frank explained. "Logic would say stay on the road where walking is easier. But humans don't always follow logic. We take risks. We make unexpected choices. Your grandfather believed that was our greatest advantage, Stallone added. These visitors think in patterns, humans break patterns. They waited until the search party had moved far enough away, then continued through the woods. Frank led them on a path that took them deeper into the forest further from the road. Shouldn't we be staying closer to the road? Kyle asked. To keep our bearings? We need to circle around, Frank replied. If they're searching the main approach to the facility, we need to come at it from a different angle. As they walked, Stallone moved up beside Frank. You seem to know these woods well. Frank nodded. My grandfather brought me hunting here when I was about Kyle's age. He said it was important to know the land around us. I never understood why, until now. He was preparing you, Stallone said. In his own way. After another 15 minutes of walking, they came to a small clearing. In the center stood a simple concrete building with no windows. It looked like a maintenance shed or pump house, the kind of structure that would go unnoticed by most people. That's it? Kyle asked, sounding disappointed. That's the secure storage facility? The best place to hide something, Ross said, is where no one would think to look. Clark pulled out a small device and scanned the area. No energy signatures. I think we're clear. They crossed the clearing quickly and reached the concrete building. There was a single metal door with no handle or lock that they could see. How do we get in? Kyle asked. Ross placed his palm against the door. After a moment, a soft blue light glowed beneath his hand. The door slid open silently. Inside, the small building was empty, except for a metal hatch in the floor. Ross knelt down and entered a code into a keypad hidden beneath a panel. The hatch unlocked with a heavy click. The real facility is underground, Ross explained. This building is just the entrance. One by one, they climbed down a metal ladder that led deep below ground. At the bottom was a long corridor lit by soft blue lights. The walls were smooth, white metal unlike anything Kyle had ever seen. What is this place, he asked in wonder. Project Starlight, Clark replied. Established in 1973 after your grandfather's encounter with the visitors. It's been maintained in secret ever since. They walked down the corridor until they reached a large circular door. Ross placed his hand on another scanner, and the door slid open to reveal a room filled with strange equipment. Some of it looked medical, some looked like weapons, and some defied easy categorization. This is it, Stallone said. Jack Miller's legacy. Frank walked slowly around the room, touching various items. My grandfather helped create all this. He was the key to everything, Ross confirmed. Without his direct experience fighting them, we would never have developed these countermeasures. Kyle moved to a display case that held what looked like modified brass knuckles with strange blue crystals embedded in them. What are these? Neural disruptors, Clark explained. They create an energy field that weakens the connection between the visitor and the host. Frank opened a cabinet and found a set of lightweight vests. And these? Protection, Stallone said. They can't stop physical damage, but they block the energy the visitors use to take control of humans. So we gear up and go get my parents? Kyle asked hopefully. Ross shook his head. It's not that simple. We need a plan. These visitors are dangerous and they're smart. We can't just walk into the observatory. But we have their weapons now, Kyle argued. We have a chance. The kid's right, Frank said. Every minute we wait gives them more time to spread, to take over more people. Clark checked his watch. Our backup team should be in position soon. They can provide support. If they haven't been compromised already, Stallone pointed out. We don't know how far this has spread. A sudden alarm began to sound. Red lights flashed along the corridor outside. What's that? Kyle asked, alarmed. Ross ran to a computer terminal. Proximity alert. Someone's approaching the surface entrance. On a screen, they could see several figures entering the concrete, building above them. Their movements were stiff and unnatural. Hosts, Clark said grimly. They found us. How? Frank demanded. I don't know, Ross replied. Unless, he turned to look at each of them in turn, unless one of us is already compromised. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group as they looked at each other with new suspicion. "That's ridiculous," Stallone said finally. "We would know if one of us had been taken over. Would we?" Clark asked. "The visitors are getting better at controlling their hosts. More subtle. The physical tells are less obvious now." "We don't have time for this," Frank insisted. "We need to get what we came for and find another way out." "Is there another exit?" Ross nodded. "Emergency tunnel. Leads to an exit half a mile away." "Then let's grab what we need and go," Frank said, picking up several of the neural disruptors and vests. Kyle followed his lead but couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He looked at the 4 men with him. One of them could be working for the visitors. But which one? The alarm continued to sound as they quickly gathered equipment. Through the ceiling, they could hear the heavy footsteps of whoever, or whatever, had found the entrance to the facility. And they were coming down. Ross rushed to a control panel on the wall and pressed several buttons. A hidden door slid open on the far side of the room. "This way to the emergency tunnel," he called out. Frank handed Kyle a vest and several of the strange devices they had found. "Put these on. Stay close to me." They could hear the sound of footsteps coming down the metal ladder from above. There wasn't much time. "Hurry," Clark urged, already moving toward the hidden exit. As they filed through the door, Frank noticed that Stallone was hanging back, looking at something on one of the shelves. "What are you doing?" Frank asked. "We need to go now." Stallone picked up a small metal cylinder. "Your grandfather told me about this, said it was the last resort." "What is it?" "A pulse device," Stallone explained quickly. "Releases an energy burst that can separate all visitors from their hosts within a half-mile radius." "Then bring it," Frank said. "It could save a lot of people." Stallone shook his head. "It's not that simple. The pulse is so strong it can cause brain damage to the hosts. That's why it was never used." The sounds from the ladder were getting closer. Frank made a quick decision. "Bring it anyway. We might need a last resort." They hurried through the door just as they heard the intruders reach the bottom of the ladder. Ross sealed the hidden door behind them, and they found themselves in a narrow tunnel with dim emergency lights along the floor. "This leads to an old mine shaft about half a mile from here," Ross explained as they moved quickly through the tunnel. "It should put us close to the observatory." "Wait," Kyle said suddenly. "If one of us is compromised, aren't we just leading them straight to where we're going?" Everyone stopped and looked at each other again. "The kid has a point," Stallone admitted. "How do we know who to trust?" Frank asked. Clark pulled out one of the devices they had taken. "These neural disruptors can be set to reveal a visitor's presence. It won't hurt a normal human, but it will cause a reaction in anyone who's been taken over." "Do it," Frank said without hesitation. "Check all of us." One by one, Clark used the device on each person. When placed against the back of the neck, it emitted a soft blue glow. Ross went first, then Frank, then Kyle. All clear. When Clark checked Stallone, the light remained blue. Finally, Frank took the device from Clark's hand. "Your turn." Clark nodded and turned around. Frank placed the disruptor against Clark's neck. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the blue light flickered and turned red. "He's one of them," Ross shouted, reaching for his weapon. Clark moved with inhuman speed, knocking the gun from Ross's hand and throwing him against the wall. His movements were fluid and precise, nothing like the man they had been with earlier. Frank reacted instantly, using one of the combat moves from his grandfather's notebook. He struck Clark at a specific point on his neck, then followed with a complex sequence of pressure points. Clark staggered back, his movements suddenly jerky and uncoordinated. "The disruptor!" Frank shouted to Kyle. "Full power!" Kyle activated the device and pressed it against Clark's chest. Clark's body went rigid, and he let out a scream that didn't sound human. His eyes glowed with an eerie blue light. Stallone moved behind Clark and applied his own neural disruptor to the base of Clark's skull. "Hold him steady." Together, they maintained the connection for several seconds. Clark's body convulsed, and then a strange mist began to seep from his pores. The mist gathered in the air above him, swirling and pulsing with its own inner light. Ross, who had recovered from being thrown, pulled out a small containment device. He activated it, creating an energy field that trapped the mist. Clark collapsed, to the ground, unconscious but breathing. "Is he?" Kyle asked, looking down at the agent's still form. "He'll be okay," Ross assured him. "The separation process is traumatic, but not fatal. He won't remember much of what happened while he was controlled." "How long has he been compromised?" Frank asked. "Hard to say," Ross replied. "But this explains how they found us. He's been leading them to us all along." Stallone looked at the containment device holding the swirling mist. "So that's what they really look like." "Just energy," Frank observed. "No physical form." "Which is why they need hosts," Ross added. "They can't interact with our world without a physical body." Kyle knelt beside Clark's unconscious form. "Will my parents be okay when we free them? Will they be themselves again?" "Yes," Ross said confidently. "Once the visitor is removed, the host returns to normal, though they may need time to recover." They heard a banging sound from the direction they had come. The intruders had found the hidden door and were trying to break through. "We need to keep moving," Stallone urged. "They'll be through that door soon." Frank helped Ross lift Clark's body. "We can't leave him here." They continued down the tunnel, moving as quickly as they could while carrying the unconscious agent. After several minutes, they saw a ladder ahead leading up to what looked like a trapdoor. "That's the exit," Ross confirmed. "It comes out in an old equipment shed near the edge of the woods." Frank turned to Kyle. "Once we're out, we head straight for the observatory. That's likely where your parents are. Remember everything I showed you from my grandfather's notebook? It could save their lives." "I remember," Kyle assured him. Ross climbed the ladder first and carefully pushed open the trapdoor. He looked around, then signaled that it was safe. One by one, they climbed out into an old wooden shed. Through cracks in the walls, they could see the observatory's dome gleaming in the moonlight about a quarter-mile away. "How do we get in?" Kyle asked. "There will be more of them inside." "We have the element of surprise," Frank said. "They think Clark is still one of them. He can be our way in." "He's still unconscious," Stallone pointed out. "Then we wait," Frank decided. "Just long enough for him to wake up." Ross checked his watch. "Our backup team should be here within 20 minutes. We could wait for them." Frank shook his head. "No. Every minute we wait gives them more time to spread, to take over more people. We go as soon as Clark is awake." As if on cue, Clark groaned and his eyes fluttered open. He looked around in confusion. What happened?" "You were taken over," Ross told him. "We got it out of you." Clark sat up slowly, holding his head. "I remember. Bits and pieces. They know about the pulse device. They're afraid of it." Stallone held up the metal cylinder he had taken from the facility. "This is what they fear. Because it could free everyone at once," Frank realized. "But at what cost?" Ross reminded them. "The pulse could cause permanent damage to the hosts." Kyle looked toward the observatory where his parents were being held. "There has to be another way." Frank put his hand on Kyle's shoulder. "There is. My grandfather found a way to fight them one-on-one. And now, so have we." Outside, they could hear vehicles approaching. Ross peered through a crack in the wall. "It's our backup team. They made it." Frank checked his neural disruptor, making sure it was ready. "Then it's time. We go in, we find Kyle's parents, and we show these visitors that they picked the wrong planet to invade." Stallone grinned. "Just like your grandfather would have done."